All right, class, welcome. I am so glad you're here today because we are embarking on a bit of a detective mission. Seriously, think about trying to understand the massive, epic finale of a superhero movie franchise without ever seeing the prequels. You'd be totally lost, right? Well, today, we're going to explore an incredible mystery as we look at how the New Testament book of Romans connects directly to its prequel, the Old Testament. As 8th graders, you're at the perfect age to start seeing how the whole Bible actually fits together into one massive, perfect story, rather than just a bunch of disconnected tales. But to really get Romans, we have to start with a serious question. And honestly, it's one that critics of Christianity have been asking for centuries. Did the Apostle Paul or anyone else in the early church just make up the gospel of Jesus Christ out of thin air? Like, was this just some clever new religion they invented in the first century? Let's find out. Section 1. A brand new idea. To solve this, to see if the message of Jesus was a brand new idea or if it was always part of God's master plan, we're going to look right at Romans chapter 1, verse 2. This gives us the definitive answer. Paul writes, which he promised before through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So Paul is telling us right out of the gate that God promised the gospel long, long ago. And when he says Holy Scriptures here, he literally means the Old Testament. Some of those promises were written over 1,000 years before Jesus was even born. So the gospel wasn't a sudden plot twist. It was a promise that God had been whispering and sometimes shouting through his prophets for centuries. Moving on to section 2, the Old Testament blueprint. I want you to think of a master architect designing a massive skyscraper, or even, a ridiculously complex Lego set. Before a single brick goes down, there has to be a detailed blueprint. Romans 3:21 brilliantly illustrates that the Old Testament is that exact blueprint. Paul writes, "But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets." Now, the law and the prophets, that's just a first-century way of saying the Old Testament. So the Old Testament was always acting like a giant glowing signpost pointing straight to Jesus Christ. It witnessed to the fact that one day, true righteousness would finally be revealed. So the Old Testament actually does some serious heavy lifting to prepare us. Think of it kind of like a mirror. On one hand, it reflects God's supreme holiness, just how perfectly good and righteous he is. But by contrast, it also reflects the harsh, messy reality of our own human sin. It proves, time and time again, that humanity absolutely cannot save itself. But through all those ancient stories, it highlights God's faithful promises, proving he never abandons his people. All of this establishes the undeniable need for salvation. It shows us exactly why we desperately need the redemption and mercy that only Jesus brings. Section 3. Abraham's living faith. Okay, so if you want to prove to a first-century audience that God's plan was always based on faith, Abraham is the absolute best example you could possibly use. If we look at the timeline logic of Abraham's life back in Genesis, a fascinating truth emerges. Abraham was actually counted righteous by God long before he ever participated in the religious ritual of circumcision. Now, why does that timeline matter? Because it proves a massive point. Religious rituals couldn't remove his sin or be the source of his righteousness. Faith has always been God's primary requirement, long before any laws or rituals were ever established. But we need to be super clear about what kind of faith Abraham actually had, because living faith isn't just sitting in a chair saying, yeah, I guess I believe this chair can hold my weight. No, it's actually lifting your feet off the ground and trusting that chair with all your weight. A living faith actively trusts God, boldly responds to God, and continues in obedience. Abraham literally packed up his entire family, left his homeland, and followed God into the absolute unknown. His faith was alive, active, and fully surrendered. And class, that is the exact same surrendered faith God requires of us today. Okay, section 4, reading with Jesus in view. Because of all this incredible evidence, moving forward, we have to read the promises, warnings, and commands of the Old Testament with Jesus clearly in view. Whether it's David facing Goliath, Moses parting the Red Sea, or prophets talking about a coming king, you are reading the blueprints of God's ultimate plan. And through Jesus Christ, that grand plan unfolds in 3 amazing stages for us believers. Step 1 is our born-again salvation, which happens the exact moment we trust in Jesus. Step 2 is our work-in-progress salvation, and hey, this is happening to you right now as an 8th grader. As you trust and obey him daily, you grow. And finally, step 3 is our future salvation, that incredible hope we look forward to when God's plan is completely fulfilled and we are with him forever. Which brings us to section 5, the godly learner. Now, as your teacher, I want to pause and make this very personal for you.
You might be sitting there wondering, why in the world are we learning to analyze these ancient texts so carefully in the 8th grade? Like, why not just read the stories and move on? Well, we study this with such depth because of what Paul writes a bit later in Romans 8, 6-7. He reminds us that to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Gathering knowledge and increasing your intelligence is fantastic for sure, but intelligence without godly wisdom can actually be really harmful. Keeping your mind continually centered on God's truth is what actually brings life and peace to your daily routine.
And this is the very core of our HeroesMart Academy Godly Learners philosophy. We purposefully intertwine biblical morality with your education here because, frankly, education without morality can hurt. A sharp mind with a moral compass is kind of like a really fast sports car with absolutely no steering wheel. It is incredibly dangerous. Our goal is that your knowledge and intelligence should help you make wise, God-honoring choices, rather than just making you more capable of doing whatever you want. We want you to vigorously pursue academic excellence, but to do so while keeping your mind completely centered on God, on His truth, on wisdom, and on making righteous choices. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a real challenge, something to chew on. How will you apply this godly wisdom to your academic excellence this week? How will you take that active, living faith we saw in Abraham and use it to completely transform the way you study, the way you treat your family, and the way you honor God? Think about this. If the creator of the universe mapped out a thousands of years old blueprint just to save you, what amazing plans does He have for the rest of your life if you completely surrender it to Him? Think on that, class. Let that truth guide everything you do and have a wonderful week.